You almost never hear a man say this out loud. Not on a podcast, not on social media, not in a barbershop conversation with people listening. A man sitting down, looking into a camera, and saying, "I had kids with multiple women. I was the problem. And if I had the sense I have now, those kids would not exist because I would have handled myself differently." That is not the kind of honesty that goes viral because it is entertaining. It goes viral because it is rare. Because the average man who has been through that situation will defend himself, explain the circumstances, point at the women involved, point at the system, point at anything except the mirror. This man pointed at the mirror. And what he said about what he found there about how Charleston White's controversial messaging on family structure and accountability actually connected with his own lived experience is worth sitting with for a minute, because this is the kind of conversation that does not happen enough, and when it does, it tends to cut through everything else.
Listen to me when I say this, and I hope this don't start no shit. It's a brother on the internet named Charleston White.
Before we get into the personal testimony, it helps to understand the context this conversation is happening in. Because Charleston White is a polarizing figure, and the reaction to his name alone tends to split people into two very different camps before they have even heard what he actually said. Charleston White has built a large following online, largely by saying things about black men, black women, family structure, and personal accountability that most people in his position would not say publicly. Some of what he says lands as genuine wisdom delivered in an unconventional package. Some of what he says is deliberately provocative and designed to get a reaction. And some of it sits in a gray area that makes even people who agree with the underlying point uncomfortable with the delivery. But one of the consistent threads running through his content underneath the aggression, the insults, the shock value, is a message about accountability, about men who father children without being present, about the cycle of dysfunction that gets passed from generation to generation when fathers are absent and mothers are left to raise children alone, about men who know better, who have been through the consequences themselves, and who still refuse to look at their own role in the problem. The host of this podcast is someone who takes that message seriously, not because he has always lived perfectly, precisely because he has not. He has been in the situations Charleston White talks about. He has been one of the men the message is aimed at, and he has had to reckon with what that means for the people he brought into the world. That reckoning is what makes this conversation different from the average social media debate about family structure.
So?
Now listen to me. Let me land this. Charleston White he don't give a what come out his mouth when you on his list. And do you know it is effective? Because these do not want him to talk about them the way he talks.
Here is where the conversation shifts from commentary about someone else to something far more personal. The host stops talking about Charleston White and starts talking about himself. And what he says is the kind of thing that requires a specific type of courage to say publicly. He has multiple baby mothers. He has children with different women. He has been that man, the man Charleston White talks about, the man the statistics describe, the man who moved through relationships and left behind children and households without a consistent father present. And when he looks back on it now, with the principles and the understanding he has built over years of living and learning and making mistakes, his honest assessment is brutal in its simplicity. If he had known then what he knows now, he would not have laid down with those women. Not because there was something wrong with them, but because he was not ready to do what laying down with a woman actually requires, which is being prepared to build a life with her if a child comes from that. That is a specific kind of clarity that most men resist. It is easier to say, "I was young, I did not know, the circumstances were complicated, she knew what it was." It is harder to say the truth, which is that the decisions I made planted seeds of dysfunction in the lives of children who had no say in the matter. The host says the harder thing, out loud, on camera. The phrase generational curse gets used a lot in these conversations. It can become a cliche, something people say to describe bad patterns without really digging into what the mechanism is. How does dysfunction actually travel from one generation to the next? The host gives a specific answer to that question. Not abstract, not theoretical, Personal. When a man sleeps with a woman, has a child with her, and leaves, what happens to that woman? She goes to someone else. She tries to fill the void that was left. She ends up in another situation that may or may not be stable. And the child who is watching all of this grows up with that as their template for what relationships look like, what men do, what women tolerate, how families form and dissolve. And the man who started that chain of events, by the time his child is old enough to see the pattern, he has often moved on to the next situation, repeating the same behavior, creating the same outcomes in a different household. This is not a story about bad people. It is a story about people who were never given a different model, who grew up in those same fractured households, who never had an example sitting at the dinner table every night, showing them what it looks like to stay, what it looks like to work through the hard parts of a relationship instead of walking away from them, what it looks like to put the children's stability above your own immediate comfort. The host is honest about this. He does not have his father as a reference point. His father was not in his life, and he traces a direct line between that absence and the choices he made as a young man, not as an excuse, as an explanation, because understanding the root is the only way to actually stop the cycle rather than just feeling bad about it. The confession would be incomplete without the other half of the story, because sitting in the pain of past mistakes is not the same thing as doing something about them, and the host did something about it. He has been married for 22 years. His current wife, his 3 children from that marriage, all of them his. He made her an honest woman, his words. He built the thing that his own childhood was missing. He became the example that he never had. That is not a small thing. It is actually the entire point. Because the critique of absent black fathers, whether it comes from Charleston White, or from social science researchers, or from the lived experience of people who grew up without one, only matters if there is a path forward. If the critique is just an accusation without a prescription, it stays stuck in shame and blame. It does not produce change. The prescription the host is offering is not complicated. It is just hard. It requires a man to look at the damage that patterns he participated in have caused, and to decide that his children are not going to inherit those patterns, not by talking about it, by showing up every day, for 22 years if that is what it takes. His daughter has never seen him with another woman. She has never seen her mother with another man. That is not a small detail. That is the entire inheritance. 22 years. That number deserves to sit for a minute because of what it actually represents in context. The host grew up without a father. He came from a family where, by his own account, only 2 or 3 people across his entire extended family are married. He made choices as a young man that followed the pattern he had been surrounded by. He had children in situations he was not prepared for. And then he built something different, from scratch, without a model to follow, for 22 years. That is not nothing. That is everything. That is the answer to the question that Charleston White's commentary raises, but does not always answer. Okay, so now what? You have diagnosed the problem. You have shamed the people who are living inside it. But what does it look like to actually get out? It looks like this. It looks like a man who did his own damage, acknowledged it honestly, and then committed to something different for long enough that his children grew up in a house where the damage stopped. His son will have had a father in the house his entire childhood. His daughter will have seen a man stay. When his kids have their own relationships, the template they carry will not be the one he inherited. It will be the one he built. That is what breaking a generational curse actually looks like. Not a statement, not an epiphany. 22 years of showing up. The host connects something else to the absent father conversation that most people in this debate skip over. He connects it to incarceration. He did 5 years in prison. He has a felony on his record. And when he looks back at how that happened, what led him to the decisions that landed him in a cell, he does not point at circumstance or bad luck or being in the wrong place. He points at the absence of his father, not to excuse himself. He is clear that he made his own choices, but he is also clear that the choices he made were shaped by what he had and what he did not have growing up. The guidance a young man gets from his father, the correction, the presence, the model, is not interchangeable with anything else. It is not something a mother can fully replicate, not because mothers are insufficient, but because certain things only transfer from a man who is there. When that is missing, Young men go looking for it. They find it in the street. They find it in older men in the neighborhood who are running exactly the kinds of operations that lead to felony records and prison sentences. They find it in peer groups that offer belonging at the price of accountability to something destructive. The host is 50% of a statistic. He is also a man who turned the statistic around. And the connection he draws between his father's absence and his own prison time is one of the clearest articulations of why this conversation matters beyond online debate. This is not abstract sociology. This is what happens when the chain breaks in real time, in real lives, in real people who then have to spend decades working backward from the damage. The host is careful to say that he does not agree with everything Charleston White puts out. He is not a Charleston White apologist. He has real disagreements with specific things Charleston White has said, particularly around how women should respond to infidelity and the double standards embedded in some of his messaging. But here is what the host recognizes that a lot of people who dismiss Charleston White entirely miss. Effective does not mean agreeable. Useful does not mean perfect. A message can have real problems in its delivery and real value in its core observation simultaneously. Charleston White's central argument about black men and family structure, that men need to stop running from accountability, stop pointing at women, stop treating fatherhood as optional, and look at the role they play in the dysfunction of their own households' lands. Because it is true, not comfortable. True, and the people who hate it most are often the people who know it is aimed at them. The host said this directly. These men do not want Charleston White talking about them. That is exactly why the content is effective. Because the reaction tells you something about how close the target is. You can disagree with how Charleston White says things. You can reject his tone and some of his conclusions. But if the core message makes you defensive, that defensiveness is worth examining. Because defensiveness is usually the first sign that something landed somewhere real. Here is what this conversation leaves you with. A man who made the mistakes, who had children in situations he was not equipped to handle, who carried a hole where his father should have been all the way into adulthood, and then watched that hole shape the decisions he made about the women in his life and the children he brought into the world. A man who then stopped, who took a look at what he was doing and decided to do something different, who has been married for 22 years to one woman, whose children are growing up in a home with both parents present, whose daughter has never seen her mother with another man, and a man who is honest enough to say, if I had known then what I know now, I would have handled myself differently. Those kids would not have been born under those circumstances. Not because I regret them, but because I know what it costs a child to come into the world without stability around them. That kind of honesty is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be, because the problem it is describing is not going away through comfortable conversations. Charleston White says it loud and provocatively. This man says it quietly and from experience. The message underneath both is the same. Look in the mirror, acknowledge what you see, and then build something different. Drop a comment letting us know your thoughts on this conversation. Do you think more men need to have this level of honesty publicly? And subscribe for more real conversations like this one.